Picture this. You are born into a community that has been watching you carefully since childhood, not with suspicion, with attention, because your community understands something that the civilization that will eventually colonize it does not. That some people arrive in the world carrying a specific combination of spiritual gifts that does not fit neatly into the categories of man or woman. And that these people are not a problem to be solved, they are a resource, a bridge, a form of human being that the community needs. You are Two-Spirit, and in about 300 years, a man carrying a cross is going to arrive and tell your community that you are an abomination. He will be wrong, but he will have guns. Let's start with what the term Two-Spirit actually means and what it doesn't mean, because this is one of the most misappropriated concepts in the history of indigenous cultures, and getting it wrong is its own form of erasure. Two-Spirit is a modern pan-indigenous term created in 1990 at a gathering of indigenous LGBTQ people in Winnipeg, Canada. It was created deliberately by indigenous people for indigenous people, as an umbrella term to describe the wide variety of gender-diverse roles that existed across hundreds of distinct Native American and First Nations cultures before European colonization. The term Two-Spirit does not mean the same thing in every culture. It is not a single identity that can be lifted out of one cultural context and applied universally. The Navajo nadleehí, the Lakota winkte, the Zuni lhamana, the Mojave huami and nadleehí, these are distinct roles within distinct cultures with distinct spiritual and social meanings. They share some characteristics, they are not identical. Here's what they have in common, broadly. Across many pre-colonial indigenous cultures in North America, there existed recognized social categories for people who did not fit the standard binary of male and female. These categories were not simply tolerated, they were often honored. People in these roles frequently held specific spiritual and ceremonial functions within their communities. They were healers, mediators, ceremonialists, artists, and advisors. Their gender diversity was not incidental to their social role, it was the source of their authority. Let's talk about specific cultures, because the abstract is easy to dismiss, the specific is harder. The Zuni of the American Southwest. In the late 19th century, already deep into the colonial period, a Zuni individual named Wewa lived and worked as a lhamana, a recognized Zuni gender category that combined elements of both male and female roles. Wewa was biologically male, but lived and worked according to female social roles, weaving, pottery, domestic labor, while also performing male ceremonial functions. In 1886, Wewa traveled to Washington, D.C. as part of a Zuni delegation. Wewa met President Grover Cleveland. They were presented to Washington society as a Zuni woman. Washington society found Wewa charming, gracious, and accomplished. They had no idea that by Zuni standards, Wewa was neither man nor woman, but something the Zuni had a specific word for, and Washington did not. The anthropologist Matilda Cox Stevenson, who knew Wewa for years, wrote extensively about the lhamana role. Her accounts, published in the late 19th century, are among the most detailed early documents of Two-Spirit existence. Stevenson clearly struggled to fit what she observed into Western categories. Her accounts are invaluable precisely because of that struggle. They document a reality that her framework could not fully contain. Now let's talk about the Navajo. The Navajo recognize 4 genders, not 2. The traditional categories are feminine woman, masculine man, feminine man, nadleehí, and masculine woman, also a form of nadleehí. The nadleehí have been part of Navajo culture since the beginning of their recorded oral traditions. They appear in Navajo creation stories. They are not an aberration in Navajo cosmology. They are part of how the world was made. The Navajo understanding of the nadleehí is that they carry both male and female spiritual energies simultaneously, which gives them access to perspectives and abilities that people who carry only one energy do not have. They are considered particularly suited to roles that require mediation, balance, and comprehensive understanding. Navajo oral traditions describe the nadleehí as essential to the proper functioning of the community. This is not a marginal role being politely accommodated. This is a cosmologically necessary category built into the structure of reality as the Navajo understand it. The Lakota winkte. In Lakota tradition, winkte are male-bodied individuals who live as women. The term translates roughly as wants to be like a woman. But the translation is inadequate. Wishing captures none of the sacred dimension. Winkte in Lakota tradition were understood to have been called to their role by the supernatural, specifically by the trickster figure double woman who appeared to them in dreams. A winkte who rejected this calling was understood to be rejecting a sacred obligation. Winkte held specific ceremonial roles. They gave sacred names to children, names considered particularly powerful because they came from a being who existed between worlds. They were consulted for their insight. They were sometimes feared because beings who exist between categories also exist between the human and the supernatural, and that proximity to the supernatural is not entirely comfortable. The historical record of the winkte is substantial. Multiple 19th century ethnographers documented winkte in Lakota communities. The documentation is not ambiguous. What is ambiguous is the subsequent history, the systematic campaign to eliminate the winkte role that accompanied the broader assault on Lakota culture, religion, and social organization during the reservation period. Now let's talk about that assault directly, because this is where the story of Two-Spirit people becomes a story about deliberate and systematic destruction, not the vague cultural pressure of westernization, but specific, targeted, institutional violence. When Christian missionaries arrived in indigenous communities across North America, they encountered Two-Spirit people and responded with what can only be described as focused revulsion. The Spanish missionaries in California used the term joyas, jewels, for Two-Spirit individuals among the Chumash and other California peoples, in a tone that made clear they considered the term deeply ironic. Missionary records document attempts to force Two-Spirit people to abandon their roles, their dress, and their ceremonial functions. Those who refused faced punishment. The boarding school system, which removed indigenous children from their families and communities beginning in the 1870s, was specifically designed to eliminate indigenous cultural transmission. The schools operated on the explicit principle that indigenous ways of being had to be destroyed for indigenous people to survive in the new American order. Two-Spirit identities were among the things targeted. Children who displayed Two-Spirit characteristics were punished. The cultural knowledge that made Two-Spirit roles intelligible, the ceremonies, the stories, the cosmological frameworks, was precisely what the schools were designed to eliminate. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 required tribal governments to adopt constitutions modeled on American democratic structures. Many of these constitutions, written under federal supervision, incorporated American legal and social frameworks that had no space for Two-Spirit roles. And Christian conversion, both coerced and voluntary, replaced cosmological frameworks in which Two-Spirit people had sacred functions with a framework in which they were sinners. The destruction was not complete. It was never complete. Two-Spirit traditions survived in some communities, sometimes openly, more often quietly. The knowledge was preserved. The roles continued to be practiced, sometimes underground, sometimes in modified forms, sometimes with the understanding that they could not be practiced the way they had been before colonization. The 1990 reclamation of the term Two-Spirit was part of a deliberate effort by indigenous LGBTQ people to reconnect with these traditions, to name what had been suppressed, and to begin the work of restoring it. This work is ongoing, it is documented, it is serious, and it is complicated by the fact that the traditions it seeks to restore were disrupted at different levels in different communities, so the restoration looks different everywhere it happens. Here is what this history tells us about erasure that we have not seen quite so clearly in any of the other stories this channel has covered. In most of the cases we have examined, the erasure came after the fact. The records were written, the lives were lived, and then someone came along and removed or reframed the documentation. In the case of Two-Spirit people, the erasure targeted the transmission mechanism itself. The boarding schools did not destroy the records of Two-Spirit people. They destroyed the community structures within which Two-Spirit knowledge was transmitted from one generation to the next. They did not burn the library. They burned the people who knew how to read it. This is the most thorough form of erasure, not destroying the evidence, destroying the capacity to understand the evidence, destroying the living context within which certain kinds of human existence make sense. The evidence still exists. The oral traditions, the ethnographic records, the oral histories, the art, the ceremonies that survived in fragments, they are there. Indigenous scholars and Two-Spirit community members are doing the work of recovery. But the work is harder precisely because what was targeted was not the record, it was the continuity. The continuity was broken. The work of repair is the longest kind of work there is. And it was broken deliberately by people who knew exactly what they were doing and who considered it a moral obligation to do it. That is the history, all of it.